Christmas dinner. I told my son and his wife that his mother needed heart surgery. He stood up, slammed his wine glass down, and shouted, "Stop asking for money! It's pathetic!" His wife twisted the knife. Every holiday, the same story. I sat quietly. They saw a broken old man. They didn't see what I was already holding. That night, 3 messages from my phone wiped out everything they had built on my money. By morning, they were begging. It was already too late. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm incredibly grateful you're here. To help us grow, comment below with your city or country. Please note this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the lesson I'm conveying is highly useful. The Christmas lights along Alameda Street were beautiful that evening. Strands of gold and white blinking softly through the living room window, the kind of lights Maggie had always insisted on because she said colored bulbs were for people who couldn't commit to elegance. 23 years in this house, and she'd never once let me put up colored lights. I used to argue about it just to watch her laugh. I wasn't laughing that night. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, before walking back to the dining room, holding the casserole dish with both hands, like it might anchor me to something solid. The table looked the way Maggie always made it look for Christmas Eve. Her grandmother's china, the silver candlesticks we'd bought at an estate sale in Carmel back in 1987, the linen napkins she ironed herself, even though her hands had been trembling more than usual lately. She'd spent 3 days cooking. Honey-glazed ham, sweet potato casserole, green beans with almonds. The whole house smelled like the Christmases I used to believe in. Preston sat at the far end of the table, already on his second glass of Bordeaux, talking about a commercial development project in Goleta, like the rest of us had come specifically to hear about square footage and zoning variances. Claudia sat beside him in a silk blouse I didn't recognize, picking at her salad, with the careful attention of a woman who ate expensively and often. Reed was across from them, quieter than usual, cutting his food without much appetite. Sophie sat beside her father, 12 years old, and already carrying herself with the particular stillness of a child who had learned that dinner tables could be dangerous. Maggie was at the head of the table, smiling the way she'd smiled through every hard thing in our 41 years together. Not because nothing was wrong, but because she believed that grace was a choice you made even when everything in you wanted to fall apart. I set down the casserole dish, pulled out my chair, and sat. "Before we say grace," I said, "there's something I need to share with the family." Preston swirled his wine without looking up. "Can it wait until after dinner, Dad?" I was in the middle of something. "No," I said, "it can't." The table shifted, that particular atmospheric change that happens when someone speaks in a register that means business. Reed set down his fork. Sophie looked up from her plate. Even Claudia paused mid-bite. I looked at Maggie. She gave me the smallest nod. "Your mother was diagnosed last Tuesday," I said. "Severe aortic stenosis, a narrowing of the heart valve. The cardiologist at Cottage Hospital says she needs surgery within the next 8 to 10 weeks. Without it, the condition will continue to deteriorate." I kept my voice level, the way I used to deliver engineering assessments on vessels that needed immediate repair. Facts first. Emotion later. The procedure is called a transcatheter aortic valve replacement. The out-of-pocket cost after our insurance coverage is $78,000. The number landed on the table, like something dropped from a height. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Preston pushed back his chair hard enough that it scraped against the hardwood and stood up with his wine glass still in hand. "Are you serious right now?" His voice had that edge I'd been hearing more and more over the past 2 years, the one that lived somewhere between disbelief and contempt. "It's Christmas Eve, Dad. We're having dinner." Preston. Reed's voice was low. A warning. No, I'm sorry, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. Preston set his glass down hard enough that wine sloshed over the rim and stained the linen tablecloth, Maggie's linen tablecloth, the one she'd ironed that morning. Every holiday, every single time we sit down together as a family, there's some kind of crisis. Some reason we need to open our wallets. My hands were flat on the table. I kept them there. Your mother has a heart condition, I said. I'm telling you because she's your mother. And what exactly do you want us to do about it? Claudia's voice was smooth, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. She dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin. Preston and I have our own financial commitments, Jean. The Goleta project alone has us stretched very thin right now. I'm sure your insurance covers more than you think. Have you actually called them, or are you just assuming the worst? I spent 4 hours on the phone with Blue Shield last Friday, I said. Well, she set her napkin back in her lap. There are payment plans, medical financing. There are options for people in your situation. People in your situation. I was 67 years old, a retired maritime engineer who had spent 4 decades calculating load tolerances and structural limits on vessels worth more than most people's neighborhoods, and my daughter-in-law was explaining medical financing to me like I'd wandered in off the street. Preston walked to the window, then turned back. His face had gone the particular red I associated with his worst moments, the color he turned when the world wasn't cooperating with his expectations. You know what the problem is. He pointed at me with one finger, and I watched that finger like it was the most important thing in the room. You and Mom never planned properly. You've been retired for 4 years, and you're still living like every crisis is our emergency. We have a life, Dad. We have a business. We have a mortgage on a house that costs more per month than you made in a year back when you were working. He paused. I'm not a bank. I haven't asked you for money, I said quietly. I told you your mother needs surgery. Same thing. He picked up his wine glass again. It always leads to the same thing. Reed stood up. His chair scraped back and he stood with both hands on the table, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something that would split the room wide open. Instead, he pressed his lips together, and I could see him making the same calculation I was making, that some fights once started don't end at dinner tables. He sat back down. Sophie hadn't moved. She was staring at her plate, and her shoulders had drawn up toward her ears the way a child's do when they're trying to take up less space in the world. I reached into the inside pocket of my sport coat and felt the folded papers there, the transfer documents for the marina property in Coos Bay, Oregon. $4.2 million in assessed value, fully paid, fully titled in my name. I'd spent 11 months working with our estate attorney to prepare the transfer. I'd planned to slide the envelope across the table to Preston after dessert, watch his face when he realized what his father had actually been worth all these years. My fingers touched the edge of the papers. Then I looked at my son. Really looked at him the way you look at something you've been avoiding examining too closely, and I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. I took my hand out of my pocket. Empty. I pulled out my phone instead. The first message went to First Pacific Bank, where I was the primary account holder on the joint business account I'd opened with Preston 18 months ago to help capitalize his Goleta project. Account access for secondary holder terminated effective immediately. The bank's mobile platform processed authorization requests in real time, I knew, because I'd set up the account myself. The second message went to my credit card company. The supplemental cards issued to Preston Calloway and Claudia Calloway canceled, effective at the next system update, which ran at midnight. The third message went to Harbor Credit Union, where I had co-signed as guarantor on the construction loan for Preston's new residential development in Carpinteria. The project hadn't broken ground yet. The loan was still in the pre-closing review period, which meant my guarantor withdrawal was legally clean No breach of existing obligation, just a rescission of a commitment not yet funded. I put my phone back in my pocket. Then I excused myself, walked to the coat closet by the front door, and reached into the inside pocket of my hanging winter jacket. The transfer documents were there, 11 pages notarized, ready for recording at the Coos County Clerk's office in Oregon. Preston's name was on page 3, designated as recipient. I walked to the kitchen, lifted the lid of the recycling bin, and dropped them in. When I came back to the table, Preston was still talking about the restaurant. He and Claudia were planning to visit in Montecito tomorrow about the New Year's trip to Scottsdale they'd booked at a resort I'd never be able to afford. He hadn't noticed I'd left the room. Maggie was looking at me. Her eyes asked a question. I picked up my fork, nodded once, and we said grace. The phone started ringing at 6:43 in the morning. I was already awake, had been since 4, lying in the dark, listening to Maggie's breathing beside me, counting the slow, steady rhythm of it, the way I used to count swells on the water when I was learning to read weather at sea. There was comfort in that sound. There was also, underneath the comfort, a quiet terror I had been carrying for 11 days, ever since the cardiologist at Cottage Hospital had shown me the echocardiogram and used words like critical gradient and valve area of 0.6 centimeters squared, and looked at me with the particular expression doctors wear when they need you to understand that time is not on your side. $78,000. After 41 years of working, saving, planning, that number sat between me and the woman I loved like a wall I hadn't finished figuring out how to climb. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. Preston's name on the screen glowing in the dark. I watched it ring. 4 times. 5. Voicemail. Then again, immediately. I picked up the phone, carried it to the kitchen, set it face down on the counter, and started the coffee maker. The house was quiet in the particular way that California mornings are quiet in December. That soft coastal stillness where the marine layer sits low over the hills and muffles everything, and for a few hours the world feels like it's holding its breath. I cracked 4 eggs into the skillet. Real eggs, the kind from the farmer's market on Cota Street that Maggie always insisted on, and that I'd been buying the store brand of for the past 3 months to save money without telling her. I squeezed 2 oranges for juice. I put 2 slices of sourdough in the toaster and stood there watching them like the outcome actually mattered. By the time I sat down with my breakfast, I had 21 missed calls. The texts had started at 6:52. From Preston. Dad, my card was declined at the Chevron on Milpass. There must be some mistake. Call me. From Claudia, 7:31. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mark had to leave his cart at Whole Foods. The kids have nothing for Christmas morning. I read each one carefully. Then I finished my eggs, rinsed the plate, and did the crossword from yesterday's Santa Barbara News Press that I'd left folded on the kitchen table. 23 across was giving me trouble, a 7-letter word for willful disregard. I worked around it and came back. Reckless. That was the word. At 10:08, someone knocked on the front door hard enough that I heard it from the back porch, where I'd taken my second cup of coffee. Not a knock that asked permission. A knock that demanded an audience. I took my time walking through the house. Claudia stood on my front porch in a cashmere coat I didn't recognize, her dark hair pulled back tight, her jaw set in the particular way it got when she had rehearsed what she was about to say and was determined to deliver it regardless of what happened next. Her phone was in her hand. She was gripping it the way people grip things when they are trying very hard not to throw them. "Good morning," I said. "You're up early for a holiday." "Don't." Her voice came out clipped, precise, like she was cutting each word off before it could get loose and say something she hadn't planned. "Don't do the pleasant routine right now, Jean. You know exactly why I'm here." "Come in," I said. "I'll get you some coffee." "I don't want coffee." But she stepped inside anyway, because Claudia had never in her life turned down an opportunity to be inside a room where decisions were being made. She stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest, looking at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be fury, and kept sliding into something closer to panic. Our cards don't work. Preston's business account is frozen. The credit line for Carpinteria gone. Do you understand what that does to us? Do you have any concept of what you've just done to our family? I poured myself a third cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. I canceled the supplemental credit cards, I said. Those were cards issued on my account under my name that I authorized for emergency use. The primary account holder on any credit card has the legal right to cancel supplemental cards at any time without notice. That's standard under federal card regulations. I exercised that right. Emergency use, she laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. We've been using those cards for 3 years. I know. Preston's business depends on that credit line. Preston's business, I said, depends on a guarantor signature I provided on a construction loan that hasn't been funded yet. I withdrew that guarantee during the pre-closing review period, which I am legally entitled to do before the loan reaches final disbursement. The bank confirmed receipt of my withdrawal letter this morning. She stared at me. You planned this. I made some phone calls, I said, after dinner, while we were sitting right there. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and underneath the fury I could hear something that might have been the beginning of genuine fear, not for me, not for Maggie, but for the particular life she had built on foundations she had never once considered might shift. While we were at the table, you sat there and you did all of that and you didn't say a word. You said quite enough for all of us, I said. Her chin came up. You can't do this. We have obligations. We have a mortgage. We have contractors who expect to be paid. You have your own money, I said. You and Preston both have incomes. You have a marketing director's salary, and he has a construction company that was operating before I ever co-signed a single document. What you don't have anymore is access to mine. I set my coffee cup down. Claudia, I want you to leave. When you and Preston are ready to have an honest conversation, not about what I owe you, but about what was borrowed and what was promised, you're welcome to call and set up a time to talk. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you stayed off my property. Her mouth opened, closed. You're serious, she said. I've been serious, I said, for longer than you've been paying attention. She left without the coffee, which I'd known she would. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her Mercedes back out of the driveway too fast and clip the edge of my neighbor's recycling bin on the way out. She didn't stop to check. In the pocket of my robe, my fingers found the receipt I'd been carrying since Tuesday, the estate attorney's billing summary for 11 months of work, preparing the transfer documents for the Coos Bay Marina. $4.2 million in assessed value. Fully paid. No liens, no encumbrances, 31 years of ownership, and a deep water berth capacity that 3 separate buyers had approached me about in the past 18 months alone. I had turned them all down because I'd wanted Preston to have it. I had wanted to look at my son across a Christmas dinner table and hand him the thing I'd spent a career building and watch him finally understand what his father had actually been. I folded the receipt back into my pocket. The recycling bin where I'd dropped the transfer documents last night was sitting at the end of the driveway, waiting for Thursday's pickup. I went inside and called Reed. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. Dad, you free this afternoon? I asked. A pause. Yeah, he said. I'll bring lunch. Bring coffee, I said. We have things to figure out. Outside, the marine layer was beginning to lift off the hills the way it always did by mid-morning, burning away in the California sun until the day turned clear and bright, and you could see all the way to the Channel Islands from the right angle. Maggie always said that was her favorite thing about Santa Barbara, the way the mornings could look impossible, and by noon everything was clear. I was counting on that. Reed showed up at 2:15 with a brown paper bag from McConnell's, the ice cream shop on State Street, that Maggie had been dragging the family to since the boys were small enough to need 2 hands to hold a cone. He set it on the counter without ceremony, 2 pints salted caramel and toasted coconut. Maggie's favorites, and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table like he'd never stopped living here, like the past 6 years of his own apartment in Santa Cruz. And then Austin had been some kind of extended business trip he was finally back from. "She sleeping?" he asked, nodding toward the hallway. "Since noon," I said. "Cardiologist said rest was the most important thing right now." Reed nodded, wrapped both hands around the mug of coffee I'd set in front of him, and looked at me with the kind of steady attention that had always unsettled me slightly, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it reminded me so much of his mother that sometimes I had to look away. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did, but to tell him everything I had to start at the beginning. Not last night's beginning, the real one. I was 26 years old when I took my first job as a junior maritime engineer with Pacific Coastal Shipping out of Long Beach. It was 1983. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, and the shipping industry along the California coast was booming in the way that things boom when a country has decided it's done being afraid and is ready to spend money again. I was good at the work, not brilliant, not the kind of engineer whose name gets attached to innovations, but the reliable kind, the kind who shows up early and stays late and learns the specific language that steel and salt water speak to each other when no one is paying attention. I met Maggie at a 4th of July party in Redondo Beach that same year. She was 23, teaching 2nd grade at an elementary school in Torrance, and she was standing at the edge of the backyard arguing cheerfully with a man twice her size about whether Steinbeck or Hemingway had a better understanding of working-class dignity. She was losing the argument on points and winning it on conviction. I didn't introduce myself that night. I just watched her, and by the time the fireworks started, I had already decided that whoever she married was going to be a very lucky man. It took me 4 months to make sure that man was me. We married in the spring of 1984, moved to Santa Barbara in 1989, when Pacific Coastal transferred me to their Central Coast operations and bought the house on Pedregosa Street with money we'd been saving since our wedding night. Terribly, a savings account. We opened the Monday after the honeymoon that we treated like a second mortgage, putting in a fixed amount every month without touching it. Maggie's idea. She had a gift for treating the future like a place worth preparing for. Preston was born in 1985. Reed came along in 1993. I want to be careful here, because I've spent a great deal of time over the past few months examining my own role in how things turned out. And I've had to be honest with myself in ways that are not particularly comfortable. Preston was not a bad child. He was a bright child, quick and charming, and certain of himself in a way that made rooms respond to him, made teachers call him gifted, made the other kids on the soccer team follow him without being asked. Those are not bad qualities. The problem, and I see this now with the clarity that tends to arrive too late to be useful, was that we never let him feel the friction of the world pushing back. When Preston wanted something, Maggie found a way. When Preston failed at something, I found an explanation. When Preston made promises and didn't keep them, we told ourselves he was young, he was busy, he was building something. Give him time. We gave him time for 20 years, and what we got in return was a 39-year-old man who genuinely believed the word family meant people who exist to absorb my shortfalls. Reed was different from the start, and I don't say that with the pride of a father who is rewriting history to favor the child who turned out well. Reed was quiet and deliberate, and spent most of his childhood doing things I didn't understand, taking apart electronics to see how they worked, building crude programs on the second-hand computer. I bought him for his 12th birthday, asking questions that started with, "But why does it work that way?" instead of, "Can I have one?" He was not the child who lit up a room. He was the child who figured out how the room's electrical system operated and why the wiring in the south wall was a fire hazard. He never asked me for money. Not once in 31 years. Not for college, he earned a full scholarship to UC Santa Cruz and worked part-time at a campus IT help desk to cover his living expenses. Not for his first apartment, not for his car, not for the down payment on a house he'd been quietly saving toward for the past 3 years. He asked for nothing, and he complained about nothing. And every time I tried to hand him something, he found a reason to hand it back. There is a particular loneliness, I've come to understand, in raising a child who doesn't need you. It leaves a space that another child, one who always needs you, who calls every crisis an emergency. And every emergency, your responsibility fills very efficiently. My mother Dorothy understood this better than anyone. She was 88 when Maggie and I moved her to Cypress Pines, the assisted living facility in Monterey, after her second fall in 6 months, made it clear she couldn't manage the house in Salinas alone anymore. She was 91 now, sharp-minded and slow-bodied, the way some people age with everything essential intact, and the packaging wearing out around it. I drove up to Monterey on the first Saturday of every month without fail, the way I'd been doing for 3 years. The drive was 2.5 hours each way, and I never once considered not going. Preston had visited 4 times total. The last time was 14 months ago at Thanksgiving, and even then he'd left before dessert, because Claudia had a migraine. My mother never said anything about this. That was its own kind of statement. I told Reed all of this not as a grievance, but as a map, because you can't understand where you are without knowing the route you took to get there, and I needed him to understand exactly how I had arrived at a Christmas Eve dinner table where my son called me pathetic for asking his mother's medical bills to matter. Reed listened without interrupting, which was his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone assembling what they'd heard into something useful. "There's something I need to tell you, Dad," he said finally. He set down his coffee mug and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Something between reluctance and resolve, the face of a person who has been holding a difficult thing and has decided it's time to put it down. "About 3 weeks ago, before Christmas." My chest tightened. "Preston called me," Reed said. "He told me he was having cash flow problems at the company. That he needed to borrow some money, not from me," he said, "but he was wondering if I thought you'd be willing to help again." Reed's jaw tightened briefly. I told him I didn't think it was a good idea. He said he understood. Then 2 days later, "He came to me himself," I said. Reed looked at me. "You already knew." "I know now," I said. "How much did he tell you he needed?" Reed pressed his lips together. "He said 25,000. Said it was for payroll. Said the workers would lose their Christmas if he couldn't cover it by Friday." The ice cream was sitting on the counter in its paper bag, slowly softening. "I transferred the money that same afternoon," I said. Reed closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, the way he did when something hurt, and he didn't want me to see it hurt. Then he opened them and reached into his jacket pocket. He slid his phone across the table toward me, screen up. It was an Instagram post. Preston and Claudia, sunbright and laughing, standing on a terrace with wine glasses raised. Behind them, rolling vineyard hills and the unmistakable Spanish colonial architecture of a resort. I recognized immediately the Carneros Resort in Napa Valley, where the weekend rate started at $800 a night. The caption read, "End of year team celebration, we earned it." The post was dated 2 days after I'd transferred the money. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Preston's face was open and easy in it, the face of a man without a single unresolved obligation in the world. "The workers," I said. "There are no workers," Reed said quietly. I called his site foreman. "The Carpinteria project is on winter shutdown, has been since November 15th. I pushed the phone back across the table. Outside, the afternoon light was going golden over the hills, the way it did in December, that low sideways California light that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time. I thought about the $25,000. I thought about the $78,000 I still needed for Maggie's surgery. I thought about the savings account Maggie and I had opened the Monday after our honeymoon and how much of it was left. "Reed," I said. "Yeah, Dad. We're going to need a plan." He reached across the table and pulled the paper bag toward him, opened it, and handed me a spoon. "I know," he said. "I've already been thinking about one." 3 weeks before Christmas, my phone rang at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was in the backyard trimming the bougainvillea that Maggie had planted along the back fence the year we moved in. The blooms were going rust-colored in the December light, the way they did every winter, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, which at 67 is one of the genuine luxuries of retirement, when Preston's name appeared on the screen. I pulled off my garden glove and answered, "Dad." His voice arrived already in motion, already carrying the breathless urgency he deployed whenever he needed something. "I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a few minutes? I need to talk to you about something serious." I set down the pruning shears. "Go ahead. It's the business." A pause carefully waited, the kind of pause that had been rehearsed. "We're in a tight spot right now. Cash flow. You know how construction goes in Q. 4 projects, slow down draws, take longer to process, but the overhead doesn't stop. Payroll, insurance, equipment leases." Another pause. "Dad, I've got 14 workers who are counting on their Christmas checks. Guys with families. Kids. I've got a payroll gap of $25,000, and the bank won't move fast enough." I looked at the bougainvillea. One branch had grown across the fence line into the neighbor's yard, slow and persistent, the way things grow when nobody's watching closely enough. "When do you need it?" I asked. "Friday," he said. "I know it's fast. I know it's a lot to ask. But these are good men, Dad, and they've worked hard all year, and I just can't let them down right before Christmas because of a timing issue. I want to tell you that something in me hesitated. I want to tell you that some finely calibrated instrument inside my chest registered the rehearsed quality of his pauses, the careful deployment of kids and families and hardworking men. I want to tell you I felt the warning before I ignored it, but the truth is simpler and more embarrassing than that. I heard my son's voice describing men who needed their Christmas paychecks, and I thought about what it meant to be a father, and I transferred the money that same afternoon without asking a single follow-up question. $25,000. Wire transfer from my personal savings account at First Pacific Bank to Preston's business operating account. Processed same day. Confirmation number ending in 7741, which I know because I still have the receipt in the filing cabinet in my office, paper-clipped to a sticky note in my own handwriting that says, "Preston Payroll Emergency, December 2024. To be repaid Q1. He came by the house that evening to pick up the paperwork. I'd wanted a simple promissory note. Just a written record, the kind of thing that reasonable adults do when money changes hands. And he sat at this same kitchen table where Reed and I were sitting now, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, I won't forget this. These guys are going to have a real Christmas because of you." He was wearing a new watch. I noticed it and said nothing. The caption, "End of Year Team Celebration, we earned it." I counted the faces in the photograph. Preston, Claudia, two couples I recognized from Preston's college years. A woman I didn't recognize at all. No workers, no families, no men who'd spent the year swinging hammers in the Central Coast heat. I set the phone on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood. My heart was beating in a way I was aware of, which is never a good sign. I sat like that for what felt like a long time, though. When I checked the clock, it had only been about 4 minutes. Then my phone rang again. Different name this time, Dr. Patricia Osei, Maggie's cardiologist at Cottage Hospital. I picked up. She didn't waste time. The additional imaging results were in. The stenosis was more advanced than the initial assessment had indicated. The valve area had narrowed to 0.6 centimeters squared. Anything below 1 centimeter is considered severe. Maggie needed a transcatheter aortic valve replacement, a minimally invasive procedure in which a new valve is threaded through a catheter and positioned inside the existing damaged one without open chest surgery. The recovery time was weeks, not months. The success rate at Cottage Hospital's cardiac unit was above 92%. The out-of-pocket cost after our Blue Shield coverage was $78,000. I wrote the number down on the notepad by the phone, the same notepad where I'd written the confirmation number for the wire transfer 2 days earlier. The two numbers sat there on the same page, $43,000 apart, and I looked at them together for a moment that I will not describe in detail because some things that happen inside a man's chest belong only to him. "Mr. Calloway," Dr. Osei said, "do you have questions?" "No," I said. "I understand completely." I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stood at the kitchen counter for a while, looking out the window at the backyard, at the bougainvillea I hadn't finished trimming, at the branch still reaching across the fence line into the neighbor's yard. I thought about the 14 workers with families and kids and Christmas checks. I thought about a watch I hadn't mentioned, and a photograph I couldn't unsee. I thought about Maggie asleep in the next room, her breathing slow and careful, her heart working harder than it should have to, just to keep up with an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. And I thought, not for the first time, but for the first time with complete clarity, that I had spent 3 years treating my grief over getting older, over losing control, over the quiet terror of watching the woman I loved get sick by writing checks to a man who had learned that my love for him was a liability he could draw against whenever he needed liquidity. I picked up the phone and called Reed. He answered on the first ring. "I saw it," I said. "I know," he said. "Dad, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, Mom," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. "Be available. I'm going to need you to help me think clearly for a while." A beat of silence, the good kind, the kind that means someone is taking you seriously. "I'll be there tomorrow," Reed said. 2 o'clock. I'll bring lunch." "Bring coffee," I said, "and don't tell your brother you're coming." I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long time that morning, watching Maggie sleep. She was lying on her side the way she always had, one hand tucked under her cheek, the blanket pulled up to her shoulder. In the gray December light coming through the curtains, she looked exactly the way she had looked the morning after our wedding. The same softness around her eyes, the same slight curve of her mouth that meant she was dreaming something pleasant. 41 years, and she still slept like a woman who had made peace with the world. Her left hand was resting on top of the blanket. The diamond caught what little light there was and threw it back in small, quiet pieces. I had bought that ring in the spring of 1984 at a jewelry store on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena that has long since been replaced by a cell phone retailer. I was 27 years old, and I had been saving for 8 months a fixed amount, pulled from every paycheck, the same discipline Maggie would later apply to our joint savings account, though I hadn't met her yet when I started. I didn't have a specific woman in mind when I started saving. I had a specific idea that when I found the right person, I wasn't going to hand her something that looked like an apology. The ring cost $4,300. In 1984, that was 2 months of my salary. I had not touched our joint savings account. That money was designated for Maggie's surgery, and I was not going to let anything else touch it, not even the $600 gap between what we had and what we needed for the hospital's deposit requirement. There were other ways to find $600. There were other ways to find more than that. I got dressed quietly, lifted the ring box from the top drawer of my nightstand. I had taken the ring from Maggie's jewelry box the night before while she slept, moving with the careful slowness of a man diffusing something, and drove to Anacapa Street. DeLuca's pawn and estate had been on that block for 31 years. I knew this because Frank DeLuca had told me so himself. The one time I'd been inside the store before 6 years ago, when I'd brought in an old chronometer I'd carried on ships for 20 years and finally decided to let go. Frank was 70 now, a thick-necked man with reading glasses. He kept pushed up on his forehead, and hands that had the particular steadiness of someone who had spent decades handling things other people valued. He remembered the chronometer. He remembered me. "Mr. Calloway," he said, when I set the ring box on the glass counter. He didn't ask what I needed. He just opened the box, lifted the ring between 2 fingers, and held it under the light, the way a doctor holds an X-ray, not to admire it, but to understand it. He examined it for 2 full minutes without speaking. I stood on the other side of the counter and looked at the wall behind him, which was hung with the accumulated surplus of other people's changed circumstances. Guitars, cameras, a trumpet, 3 watches, a coin collection in a mahogany case. "Round brilliant cut, approximately 1.4 carats, Frank said, finally setting the ring down. "The setting is platinum, which holds better than white gold over time. This was well cared for." He looked up at me. "How long?" 41 years, I said. He nodded the way a man nods when he understands that a number represents more than a number. He didn't ask whose ring it was or why I was selling it. Frank DeLuca had been in this business long enough to know that the reasons people brought things through his door were almost always the same reason, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. "I can offer 8,500, he said. I had expected 6. The number hit me somewhere behind the sternum, not because it was low, but because it was real, because the moment he said it, the ring became a transaction, and for a moment the ground shifted slightly under everything I'd built my life on top of. "That's fair," I said. I signed the paperwork. Frank counted out the cash, $8,500, in hundreds and fifties, the bills clean and deliberate, and slid it across the counter in a manila envelope. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket. The ring stayed on the counter, sitting in its open box under Frank's glass display light. I did not look at it again when I walked out. Preston found out by Tuesday. I still don't know how. Perhaps someone from the family had seen my car, parked on Anacapa. Perhaps Claudia had contacts in places I hadn't considered. Perhaps the universe simply has a talent for making certain things visible to the people who will do the most damage with the information. He called 4 of our relatives before noon to inform them that his parents were in such financial distress that his father had been forced to sell his mother's wedding ring. He did not call me. He did not call Maggie. He did not ask whether there was anything he could do. On Thursday morning, 3 days after I'd walked out of DeLuca's, my phone rang at 9:15. The number was local but unfamiliar, and I almost let it go to voicemail. "Mr. Calloway, this is Frank DeLuca." His voice was careful, the way voices get when someone is about to say something that matters. "I need to let you know the ring has been redeemed." I sat down in the nearest chair. "Someone came in yesterday afternoon," Frank continued. "Young man, maybe 30, paid cash. Wouldn't give his name. He just said, Frank paused, and I could hear him consulting something, a note, perhaps something he'd written down. Tell him it belongs home. My throat closed in a way that made speaking temporarily unavailable. Mr. Calloway, you still there? Yes, I managed. Thank you, Frank. Thank you for calling. I sat in that chair for a while, after I hung up. The house was quiet around me. Maggie was at her Thursday morning appointment with her general practitioner, the routine one she'd had for 15 years, the one she refused to let me accompany her to, because she said it made her feel like an invalid when I sat in the waiting room looking worried. That evening, Reed knocked on the front door. He was wearing the same jacket he'd had on when he left on Christmas afternoon, which meant he'd driven straight from wherever he'd been. He stepped inside without ceremony, reached into his jacket pocket, and set a small velvet box on the kitchen table. He didn't explain. He didn't ask for acknowledgement or gratitude or anything at all. He just sat down in his chair, reached for the coffee pot, and poured himself a cup like a man who had done an ordinary thing on an ordinary evening. I opened the box. The ring sat in its velvet groove, the diamond catching the kitchen light, the same way it had caught the bedroom light 3 mornings ago, those same small, quiet pieces thrown back at me like a reminder that some things have a way of finding their way home. I looked at my son. He was looking at his coffee. Reed, I said. Don't, he said not unkindly. Just make sure Mom gets it back before she notices it's gone. The drive up Highway 1 to Monterey takes 2 hours and 40 minutes from Santa Barbara on a clear January morning, longer if you get caught behind a truck on the grade above Morro Bay, which I did. I didn't mind. I had the window down 2 inches and the radio on a station that played nothing, recorded after 1975, and for stretches of that drive, the part where the highway hugs the coast and the Pacific sits right there beside you, gray-green and enormous, and entirely indifferent to human difficulty, I felt something close to peace. Maggie had wanted to come. I'd told her the cardiologist's instructions were specific about rest, which was true, and that the drive was too long, which was also true, and that I would give Dorothy her love, which I intended to do. What I didn't say was that I needed the 2 hours and 40 minutes of that drive to think the way I used to think on ships, with my hands occupied and the horizon in front of me and nothing requiring an immediate answer. I had called Preston on Wednesday. Mom asked about you, I'd said, which was not entirely accurate. Dorothy had asked about everyone the way she always did, because at 91 she had decided that life was too short for selective affection. But I'd known that framing it as Dorothy's request was the only way to get Preston through the door of a place he'd been avoiding for 8 months. Sure, Dad, he'd said with the particular brightness people use when they're agreeing to something they intend to be inconvenient. I'll be there. Cypress pines sat on a hillside above Cannery Row, a low building with good bones and a garden that the staff kept better than most people kept their own yards. I'd chosen it for the garden partly, and for the fact that the dining room had windows on 3 sides, and Dorothy had always been a woman who needed to see the sky while she ate. She was waiting in her usual chair by the window when I arrived, dressed in the burgundy cardigan she wore on what she called important days, which apparently included first Saturdays and any day she was expecting company. She was 91 years old, and she weighed perhaps 110 pounds, and her hands shook when she reached for things. But her eyes were the same dark, steady brown. They'd always been the eyes of a woman who had raised 3 children alone after my father died at 54, who had worked the front desk of a Salinas hotel for 22 years to do it, and who had never once in my memory complained about any of it. Eugene, she said, when I bent to kiss her cheek. She still called me Eugene. She was the only person left on earth who did. Hi, Mom. You look tired, she said. I'm fine. You look tired, she said again, which was her way of indicating that the subject was not closed, merely deferred. We were halfway through lunch. The Cypress Pines kitchen made a corn chowder that Dorothy had been recommending to me for 3 years when Preston arrived. He came through the dining room door with the particular energy of a man making an entrance, shoulders back, phone already in his jacket pocket, with the practiced gesture of someone who has decided to perform attentiveness. He kissed his grandmother's cheek, shook my hand with a grip that was slightly too firm, and settled into the chair across from her with his menu. "Grandma," he said, with the warm, broad smile he deployed for rooms that contained people he wanted to impress. "You look amazing. Seriously, you haven't aged a day." Dorothy looked at him with an expression that I recognized, the expression of a woman who has been told many pleasant and inaccurate things over 91 years and has developed a sophisticated immunity to all of them. "You haven't been here since April," she said. Preston's smile held. "It's been a busy year, Grandma. The business—" "April," she said again. Not accusatory, just precise. Dorothy had always believed that facts were most effective when delivered without decoration. The chowder arrived. We ate. Preston talked about the Carpinteria project with the expansive confidence of a man describing achievements, though I noticed he didn't mention the frozen accounts, or the withdrawn guarantee, or the credit cards that had stopped working on Christmas morning. He talked about a new truck he was considering. He talked about a ski trip he and Claudia were planning for February. At some point, Dorothy set down her spoon and looked at her grandson with the particular quality of attention that I associated with her most serious moments, the attention she'd used when I was 17 and had lied to her about where I'd been on a Friday night, the attention that made you feel simultaneously seen and ashamed of whatever you were trying to hide. "Preston," she said, "why is your father tired?" Preston glanced at me, then back at her. "Dad's fine, Grandma. He's just—" "Your mother is sick," Dorothy said. "Your father has been managing her medical situation, his own finances, and visiting me every month without missing a single visit in 3 years." She picked up her spoon again. "When was the last time you asked him how he was doing? Not what he could do for you. How he was." The dining room had the particular quality of silence that happens when other people in a shared space register that something real is occurring nearby. At the table beside us, a woman in her 80s was carefully not looking at us while clearly hearing every word. Preston's jaw tightened. "Grandma, I don't think this is—" "I'm 91 years old," Dorothy said with the serenity of someone who has earned the right to finish her sentences without interruption. "I don't have the time or the patience for conversations that avoid the point." She looked at Preston directly, and her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, did not take on any of the qualities people use when they want to wound. It was simply clear. "Your father built the only thing that ever mattered in this family, Preston. And you just insulted him in front of the woman he's been caring for 30 years. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Preston pushed back his chair. He said something about needing to make a call. He walked out of the dining room without looking at either of us, and through the window I watched him cross the garden with his phone already at his ear, shoulders tight, moving the way people move when they need to put space between themselves and something they don't know how to answer. Dorothy watched him go. Then she picked up her corn chowder and took a careful spoonful and looked out at the garden where her grandson was pacing among the winter roses. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Eventually." "I know, Mom. But not yet." She patted my hand with fingers that trembled slightly and gripped with surprising strength. "You're doing the right thing, Eugene. Whatever you're doing the right thing." I covered her hand with mine, and we sat like that for a while, watching Preston pace and the roses move in the January wind off the bay, And I thought about Reed, about the conversation we'd had on Christmas afternoon, about the plan he'd said he was already thinking about the job application he'd mentioned in passing last week, something at a company called Novatech, that he said looked promising. He'd been characteristically understated about it the way he was understated about everything he actually cared about. I hoped it came through for him. After everything he deserved, something to go right. On the drive home with the Pacific back beside me and the radio on, I let myself feel briefly the full weight of what my mother had said. The only thing that ever mattered. I had built something. I had built it over 40 years, with careful hands and long hours, and the particular stubbornness of a man who believed that the future was worth preparing for. And I had almost handed it to someone who had looked at everything I'd built and seen only what he could take from it. Almost. Preston called on a Thursday evening, which I noted because he almost never called on Thursdays. Thursdays were for poker with his college friends at someone's house in Hope Ranch, a tradition he'd maintained with the religious consistency he applied to nothing else in his life. "Dad, we need to get together," he said. "The family. Just to talk. Clear the air." A pause. "I think we got off on the wrong foot at Christmas, and I'd like to fix that." Clear the air. As if what had happened at the dinner table was a misunderstanding about whose turn it was to do the dishes. "When?" I asked. "Sunday evening. Come to the house 7 o'clock. Reed too if he wants." I said I'd be there. Then I called Reed and told him what Preston had said, and Reed was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when he was running calculations. "I'll be there," Reed said. "And Dad, I'm going to bring someone." "Who?" "Patricia Holt," he said. "She called me this week. She'd heard about Mom through Maggie's book club network and she wanted to help. I think you should let her." Patricia Holt had spent 22 years on the federal bench in the Northern District of California before retiring to Santa Barbara 4 years ago. She and Maggie had met at a reading group at the downtown library 18 months earlier, and had become the kind of fast friends that women in their 60s sometimes become immediate uncomplicated, built on the recognition of a shared quality rather than a shared history. Maggie called her Pat. Patricia called Maggie the only person in this city who has actually read all of Middlemarch. She was 68 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and had the particular posture of someone who had spent 2 decades sitting behind a bench, deciding things that mattered. I had met her twice at the house for dinner, and come away with the impression of a woman who listened more carefully than almost anyone I'd encountered and spoke only when she had something worth saying. "All right," I said. "Bring her." Preston's house in Montecito sat behind a set of iron gates on a street where the lots started at 2 acres and the landscaping was maintained by people who were never seen doing it. I'd been to the house perhaps a dozen times in the 4 years since Preston and Claudia had bought it, and each time I arrived I had the same thought, that it was a beautiful house that had been purchased to be seen rather than lived in the architectural equivalent of the watch Preston had been wearing the night he came to pick up the promissory note paperwork. I parked on the street and walked up the driveway. The living room had been arranged with a deliberateness that told me this had been planned. 2 armchairs positioned to face the couch, a low table between them, with a water pitcher and glasses. The overhead lights dimmed to the particular warmth that interior designers use when they want a room to feel therapeutic rather than confrontational. Preston was on the couch with Claudia beside him. A man I didn't recognize sat in one of the armchairs, mid-50s khaki pants, a blue Oxford shirt, a notepad on his knee. He had the careful, neutral expression of a professional who had been briefed. "Dad?" Preston came forward, shook my hand with both of his the way politicians do. "Thanks for coming. This is Dr. Harmon. He works with families going through transitions. Transitions. I shook Dr. Harmon's hand and sat in the remaining armchair and looked at my son across the low table with its water pitcher and its careful lighting, and thought about the word transitions and what Preston imagined it covered. "Where's Reed?" Claudia asked, glancing at the door. "He said he'd be a few minutes behind me," I said. Preston nodded and launched into it gently, the way you approach something you've rehearsed, to sound unrehearsed. "He was worried about me," he said. The family was worried. The decisions I'd been making lately, the frozen accounts, the canceled cards, the scenes at Christmas, these were concerning to people who loved me. He used the word erratic twice carefully, like he was testing its weight. He used the phrase, "since Mom got sick," with a practiced sorrow that might have convinced someone who hadn't watched him spend Christmas morning on the phone with a ski resort in Park City finalizing a February reservation. Dr. Harmon took notes. Claudia spoke about how difficult it was to watch a parent lose their footing. She used the word footing. I sat and listened and kept my hands relaxed on the arms of the chair, because I was a 67-year-old retired maritime engineer who had spent 4 decades assessing structural integrity under pressure, and I knew the difference between a building that was failing and a building that was being falsely condemned for someone else's benefit. Preston was getting to the point. I could feel it the way you feel a wave building offshore before it arrives when the front door opened. Reed came in first, carrying his jacket over one arm. Behind him, Patricia Holt stepped into the living room in a charcoal blazer and reading glasses pushed up on her head, carrying a leather folio, the way she'd probably carried briefs for 2 decades, with the easy authority of someone who understood that documents were power. The room changed when she walked into it. I don't know how else to describe it. The temperature didn't change, the lighting didn't change, but something in the quality of the air shifted the way it shifts on a ship when the officer of the watch changes and the new person on deck happens to know more than the last one. "Preston," Reed said, with a nod that was cordial and nothing more. "Claudia, this is Patricia Holt. She's a friend of the family." Preston looked at Patricia with the rapid assessment of a man recalibrating. "I don't think we haven't met," Patricia said pleasantly. She sat on the arm of the couch without being invited to sit anywhere, which was a very specific choice. "I spent 22 years as a federal judge in the Northern District before I retired. I'm here as a friend of Maggie's and a witness." She opened her folio and removed a document, set it on the low table beside the water pitcher. "This is an independent neurological assessment of Eugene Calloway, conducted 3 days ago at Cottage Hospital by Dr. Renata Vasquez, who chairs the neurology department. The assessment finds no cognitive impairment of any kind. No memory deficits, no disorientation, no indicators of diminished capacity." She looked at Preston steadily. "I wanted to make sure that was on the table before this conversation went any further." Dr. Harmon stopped writing. "Patricia," Preston started, "the process of filing for conservatorship of a competent adult in California requires a petition to the probate court, a court investigator's report, a capacity declaration from a licensed physician, and a hearing before a judge," Patricia said, with the measured pace of someone reading from something they know by heart. "Filing such a petition based on fabricated or exaggerated claims of incapacity constitutes elder abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15,610. The penalties include civil liability and criminal prosecution." She closed the folio. "I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm here as your grandmother's friend's friend telling you what I know. What you do with that information is your business." The room was very quiet. Claudia was looking at Preston. Preston was looking at the document on the table. Dr. Harmon was looking at his notepad, and then at the door with the expression of a man calculating the most professionally dignified route to the exit. Reed was looking at me. I stood up, put on my jacket, and looked at my son across the low table and the water pitcher and the carefully dimmed lights. "Thank you for having me over," I said. "Give my best to Sophie." I walked out through the front door and down the driveway and got in my car and sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet of a Montecito street at 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening. Through the living room window, I could see the shapes of people still inside, and then I saw Claudia stand up and point at Preston, and Preston's hands come up in the gesture of a man defending himself, and I understood that whatever came next in that room was no longer about me at all. I sat in the car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard, the way I used to watch gauges on ships when something was running outside normal parameters, and I needed to know exactly how long it had been doing so. The living room window of Preston's house was lit up like a stage set, and the people inside it were moving the way people move when a conversation has left the territory of performance and entered something rawer and less controlled. Claudia was standing. Preston was standing. Their mouths were moving, and their hands were doing the particular work that hands do when words aren't quite carrying the weight being asked of them. I was about to start the engine when Reed tapped on the passenger window. I unlocked the door, and he got in, bringing with him the cold of a January night in Montecito, and the particular smell of his jacket, something wool and familiar, that I associated with every winter of his childhood. He was carrying a manila envelope, which he set on the dashboard without comment. "Patricia wanted you to have this," he said. "She said she was sorry she couldn't stay to explain it herself. She had a 10 o'clock. "What is it?" Reed looked at the envelope, then at the window where Preston and Claudia were still engaged in whatever was consuming them. "Financial records," he said. "Patricia got them through a contact she has at the county clerk's office. Legal pull properly documented." He paused. "You should probably read them before you drive home." I opened the envelope. The documents inside were organized with the precision of someone who had spent decades preparing exhibits for court, tabbed, dated, annotated in the margins with a handwriting I recognized as Patricia's from the notes she'd made in her folio during the meeting. Bank statements, transfer records, a corporate account summary for Callaway Construction, LLC, which was Preston's company with a sub-account I had not known existed. It took me about 4 minutes to understand what I was looking at. Over the previous 19 months, $95,000 had been withdrawn from Callaway Construction's operating account in transfers ranging from $800 to $12,000, processed at irregular intervals, in a pattern that suggested deliberate obfuscation, small enough individually to avoid automatic flagging, spaced far enough apart to avoid pattern recognition, in a casual review. The destination account was a personal savings account at a different bank in a different name. The name on the destination account was not Preston's. I sat with that for a moment. $95,000. 19 months. An account in a name that was not my son's, not my daughter-in-law's, and not any name connected to the business I had helped capitalize with my own retirement savings. Through the window, Claudia was pointing at something on her phone, holding it up, showing it to Preston, with the aggressive posture of someone producing evidence rather than making an argument. Preston's face had gone through several colors in the time I'd been watching, and had settled on something I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not contempt. Something that looked from this distance very much like the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is not where he thought it was. Reed was watching too. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Patricia found it 3 days ago," he said. "She didn't want to bring it into the room tonight until she was certain it was solid. The documentation is clean, properly obtained, legally admissible." He turned from the window and looked at me. Dad, I want to tell you something. I know this is a lot on top of everything else. And I know that watching your son's marriage fall apart in a window from a car in his driveway at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night is not how you imagined any of this going. No, I said, it isn't. But those $95,000… Reed stopped, started again. That money came from the company account, the same account you helped capitalize, which means some of what Claudia transferred out of that account was originally yours. I looked at the documents in my lap, the transfer records, the account numbers, the dates stretching back 19 months to a period when I'd still believed that what I was doing was helping my son build something real. Inside the house, Claudia turned away from Preston and walked out of the frame of the window. Preston stood alone in the living room for a moment, and I watched him put both hands on the back of the couch and lean forward and drop his head. And in that posture, he looked briefly like someone much younger than 39, like the boy he'd been before, whatever it was that had happened to him, the slow erosion of character that occurs when no one ever says no. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a certain emotion at moments like this, the vindication of someone whose version of events has been confirmed, the pleasure of watching the architecture of a lie begin to come apart. I felt none of that. What I felt was the particular exhaustion of a man who has been right about something he desperately wished he'd been wrong about. Reed, I said, yeah, your mother can't know about this yet. I refolded the documents and slid them back into the envelope. Not until she's stronger. Not until after the surgery. Reed nodded. I know. And Preston. I stopped. Looked at my son through the window, still leaning on the couch, still wearing the posture of someone whose internal structure has shifted in a way that will take time to assess. Whatever is happening in there that's between him and Claudia now, I'm not going to involve myself in it. Understood? I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. It sat there against my chest with the particular weight of something that would need to be dealt with carefully and at the right time and with the right help. There's something else, Reed said. He was looking at his hands now the way he did when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. I got a call back from Novatech yesterday. They want me to come in for a final round interview. Thursday morning. Novatech Solutions was one of the faster-growing technology companies in the Central Coast Corridor. A software firm that had expanded from a 2-person startup in Ventura to a 400-person operation with offices in Santa Barbara and Austin in 11 years. I knew this because Reed had told me about them 6 weeks ago with the particular restrained enthusiasm he reserved for things he actually cared about, and I had gone home and looked them up. That's the one you've been tracking, I said. Senior developer position. He finally looked up. It's a good role, Dad. The kind of role that it's the kind of thing I've been working toward for a while. I put my hand on his shoulder briefly, the way I used to when he was young and had accomplished something he was trying not to seem too proud of. You'll do well, I said. He nodded, and I could see him already somewhere else, already in that interview room, already running through the technical questions he'd be asked, already thinking about answers. Reed prepared for things the way I used to prepare for difficult crossings, thoroughly, quietly, without announcing it. I started the engine. Call me Thursday, I said. After. I will. He opened the door and stepped out into the Montecito cold. Then he leaned back in one hand on the roof. Dad, you're going to be all right. I need you to know that. I looked at my son standing in the dark outside his brother's gate with the manila envelope in my jacket, and the lit window behind him, and the whole long weight of the past several weeks pressing down on the evening. I know, I said. And for the first time in a while, I meant it. Thursday came and went without a call. I noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound. You've been listening for, not all at once, but gradually, as the afternoon stretched into evening, and the evening settled into the particular quiet of a house where someone is trying not to think about something. I made dinner. I watched the news. I set my phone on the kitchen table where I could see it, and told myself that no news was probably good news, that final round interviews sometimes ran long, that Reed would call when he had something to say. He called Friday afternoon just after 2. "Hey, Dad." 2 words, and I knew. There is a specific quality to a voice that is managing disappointment, a careful flatness, a slightly too controlled pace. The sound of someone who has decided in advance not to make more of something than they're going to allow themselves to make of it. Reed had used that voice perhaps 3 times in his life that I could remember, and each time it had cost him something real to maintain it. "Tell me," I said. He came over that evening with takeout from a Thai place on Milpass Street that we'd been ordering from since he was in high school, pad CU for me. Green curry for him, the same order we'd been placing for 15 years. He set the containers on the kitchen table and sat down and told me about Thursday. The morning had started well. The technical portion of the interview had gone the way Reed's technical interviews always went, thoroughly confidently, with the particular ease of someone who understood the underlying architecture of what they were being asked about, rather than just the surface answers. The 2 senior engineers who'd interviewed him had been engaged asking follow-up questions rather than checking boxes, which Reed had taken as a good sign. Then the 3rd interviewer came in. His name was Derek Ashworth, Reed said, opening his curry. Director of Human Resources. I'd done my research. He's been with Novatech about 4 years, came up through the HR track at a couple of software companies before that. Normal background. Reed paused. But the questions changed when he sat down. They weren't technical anymore. They were personal. He kept referencing things I couldn't place. Concerns about my conduct at a previous employer. Questions about how I handled conflict with supervisors. At one point he said they'd received information suggesting I had a history of his word instability. I set down my fork. "Instability," I said. I asked him to be specific. Reed's jaw was tight the way it got when he was holding something in that wanted very badly to come out differently. He wouldn't be. He just kept referring to documentation he'd received from a source he described as credible and familiar with my professional history. Reed looked at me directly. "Dad, I have never had a disciplinary issue at any job I've ever held. Not a warning, not a write-up, not a single conversation with a manager that ended badly. My references are clean. My record is clean. I've been at the same company for 4 years with 2 promotions and a performance rating that has never been below exceeds expectations." "I know that," I said. The rejection email came at 4:17 Friday afternoon. He pulled out his phone and read it to me, the standard language of corporate non-commitment. The phrases that said nothing while appearing to say something, the particular cowardice of institutional correspondence. "After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with a candidate whose background more closely aligns with our current needs." Reed put the phone down. "I've been getting those emails for 10 years, Dad. I know what a real rejection sounds like versus what it sounds like when someone has gotten there before you." The food sat between us, getting colder than either of us was addressing. "Miles Garrett called me this morning," Reed said. Miles Garrett had been Reed's closest friend since their first year at UC Santa Cruz, a systems engineer with the kind of methodical mind that made him very good at understanding how information moved through organizations and very bad at small talk. He had been at Novatech for 2 years working on infrastructure, and he and Reed had maintained the particular friendship of 2 technically minded people who respected each other's competence above everything else. He works in systems infrastructure, Reed continued, which means he has visibility into certain internal processes that most employees don't. He told me that 3 weeks ago, Derek Ashworth received a package physical documents delivered by courier containing what was described internally as a disciplinary file from one of my previous employers. The file included incident reports, a termination recommendation that was apparently never acted upon, and a character assessment from a supposed former supervisor. Reed looked at me steadily. "None of it exists," he said. "I've never been written up. I've never had a termination recommended. The supervisor named in the documents left the company I worked for in 2019, and I never reported to him directly." He picked up his fork, looked at it, set it back down. Miles pulled the courier tracking number. The package originated from a shipping depot in Goleta, where Preston's Carpinteria project offices were located. I sat with that for a moment. The specific landing weight of it, the way a wave hits, not when you see it coming, but when it actually reaches you. My son had fabricated professional misconduct records and delivered them by courier to the human resources director of the company his brother was interviewing with, and the human resources director had accepted them and acted on them because the man who sent them was Preston Calloway, who had gone to UC Santa Barbara with Derek Ashworth and had maintained that connection with the careful, instrumental patience of someone who understood that relationships were tools. "Derek Ashworth," I said. "He and Preston know each other." "Fraternity," Reed said. "Same pledge class 2004. Miles confirmed it." I pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where the bougainvillea was still reaching over the fence line, still growing in the direction it had decided to grow regardless of where the boundary was. Preston had not just taken from me. That had been bad enough. Preston had looked at the one person in our family who had never asked for anything, who had never sauced anyone anything, who had simply worked hard and done his job and tried to build a life with his own hands. And he had reached into that life and broken something in it, not for gain, not for money, but because Reed had stood up at a dinner table and told the truth. The anger I felt was not the hot kind. It was the cold kind, the kind that does not dissipate quickly, the kind that settles into the structure of a person and becomes load-bearing. "I'm going to need you to write down everything Miles told you," I said without turning from the window. "Every detail. The courier tracking number, the dates, the contents of the file as Miles understood them, Ashworth's name, the fraternity connection. Everything already done." Reed's voice was quiet. "It's in a document I started Thursday night when Miles first called me. I've been adding to it." I turned around. My son was sitting at the kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in since he was old enough to reach the table, with his green curry going cold in front of him and his phone beside it, and the expression on his face of a man who was angry and sad, and underneath both of those things, waiting to see what his father was going to do with what he'd just been handed. "Good," I said. I came back to the table and sat down and picked up my fork. "Eat your dinner. We have calls to make tomorrow." Reed looked at me for a moment. Then something in his face eased slightly, not relief exactly, but the particular settling that happens when a person realizes they are not going to be carrying something alone. He picked up his fork. "Okay, Dad," he said. "Tomorrow." Before I reveal the shocking evidence that completely exposed my son's schemes, comment the word "exposed" down below, so I know you're still here with me. And please note, the next part of our story contains some fictional elements and may not be entirely factual. If you don't wish to hear them, you are welcome to turn off the video right here. Maggie had been at Santa Barbara General for 11 days by the time Preston showed up at my door with a casserole dish. The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday, the transcatheter procedure, the one Dr. Osei had explained 3 times with the patience of someone who understood that some information needed repetition before it became real. The deposit had been paid. The preoperative appointments were done. Maggie had spent the past week in the cardiac monitoring unit on the third floor, where the nurses knew her name, and she had already organized a book exchange with the woman in the room next door, because Maggie could not be in any environment for more than 48 hours without finding a way to make it function better. I visited every morning at 7 and every evening at 6. In between, I came home to a house that was very quiet, in a way that houses only get when the person who gives them their particular sound is absent. It was during one of those in-between hours on a Tuesday afternoon in early March that I had climbed onto a step stool in the kitchen and finished installing the last of the 3 security cameras I'd ordered online 2 weeks earlier. Small devices, each about the size of a deck of cards, positioned at the upper corners of the room, where they could cover the full space without obstruction. I had printed the notification placard from the manufacturer's website, white cardstock, black text, mounted beside the back door at eye level. This property is monitored by video and audio security systems. California law required notice for audio recording in shared spaces, and I had given it. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. I had installed the cameras because Maggie had been asking me to. For 2 years, she'd been worried about the back entry, since the neighborhood association sent around a notice about package thefts, and because after everything that had happened in the past 3 months, I had decided that the time for being unprepared was over. The cameras had been running for 9 days when Preston knocked. He was standing on the porch with a ceramic dish covered in foil and an expression of carefully constructed concern. The expression of a man who has rehearsed sincerity in the mirror and is now field testing the result. He was wearing a fleece vest over a button-down, which was Preston's version of casual, and his hair was slightly less groomed than usual, which I understood was meant to suggest that he had rushed over out of genuine worry rather than strategic timing. "Come in," I said. He settled into the chair at the kitchen table, the one that faced the window, not the one that faced the back corner, where the camera sat at the upper left of the room, its small indicator light glowing amber behind the notification placard on the door. I set the casserole on the counter and put water on for coffee, and we talked about the weather and the Dodgers' spring training prospects, and whether the road construction on Highway 101 near Carpinteria was ever going to be finished. Preston was good at this. That had always been true. He could fill a room with conversation the way certain people fill rooms with music, naturally, continuously, without apparent effort, and if you didn't know what you were listening for, you might mistake it for warmth. I knew what I was listening for. It came about 20 minutes in after the coffee was poured, and he'd asked about Maggie's surgery date, and nodded with the grave attentiveness of a devoted son. "So the marina," he said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, as if it were a natural next topic after heart surgery and spring training. "Have you thought any more about what you're going to do with it long term? I mean, with Mom's recovery and everything, managing a property up in Oregon has to be—" "I think I need to run to the pharmacy," I said, standing up. "Maggie's prescription is ready. I completely forgot." I pulled on my jacket and picked up my keys. "Help yourself to more coffee. I'll be back in 20 minutes. I was back in 8. The pharmacy on Chapala Street was 6 blocks away, and I did not go to it. I walked to the end of my driveway, stood beside the neighbor's rose hedge for 8 minutes, and walked back. I had learned in 40 years of engineering that the most useful diagnostic tool is often simply giving a system the opportunity to behave as it would behave when it believes it is unobserved. I came in through the front door quietly and stood in the hallway. From the kitchen came Preston's voice, lower than his regular register, the particular frequency people use on phone calls they consider private. Worked perfectly. Colton pulled the file the same day I sent it, didn't ask a single question. A pause, listening. No, the kid has no idea. He thinks it was a legitimate rejection. A sound that was unmistakably a laugh, easy satisfied the laugh of a man recounting a success. Honestly, Claude, it was almost too easy. All I had to do was make it sound credible. I stood in the hallway with my keys in my hand. Look, if he gets another interview somewhere else, I've got more contacts. Half the tech companies in Santa Barbara have someone from our circle in a hiring role. We can do this again. Another pause. The old man's been moping around visiting Mom every day, not thinking straight. By the time he figures out what happened, if he ever does, Reed will have given up on this market and moved to Austin or Seattle or wherever these developer types go when they can't make it here. I put my keys in my jacket pocket very carefully, the way you put things down when you need your hands to be steady. I gotta go, Preston said. He'll be back soon. But listen, we need to talk about the marina paperwork. If we can get him to agree to a property management arrangement while Mom's recovering, we can start building the paper trail we need for. I walked into the kitchen. Preston turned. His face moved through 3 expressions in approximately 1 second surprise calculation, and the reconstruction of warmth with the speed of a man who had been doing that particular sequence his entire adult life. Hey. He lowered the phone. That was fast. Prescription wasn't ready after all, I said. I poured myself the coffee I hadn't finished and sat down across from him and looked at my son over the rim of the mug. The amber light of the camera glowed steadily in the upper left corner of the room behind the notification placard recording at 4K resolution with directional audio pickup, the way it had been recording since the moment Preston walked through my door. He smiled at me. I smiled back. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important, and then he said he had a meeting and gathered his jacket and told me to give his love to Mom, and I said I would. And I walked him to the door and watched him back his truck down the driveway with the ease of a man who believes he has just had a productive afternoon. I closed the front door, stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, sat down and called the number the attorney had given me 3 weeks ago, the one I hadn't used yet because I had wanted to wait until I had something worth calling about. She answered on the second ring. This is Jean Calloway, I said. I think it's time we met. The surgery took 4 hours and 19 minutes. I know the exact duration because I sat in the cardiac waiting room on the 3rd floor of Santa Barbara General from 7:42 in the morning until 1:57 in the afternoon, watching the clock above the coffee station with the focused attention of a man who has decided that if he looks away, something will go wrong. The waiting room had 12 chairs, a television mounted too high on the wall showing a home renovation program with the sound off and a window that faced the parking structure. I did not watch the television. I did not look out the window. I drank 3 cups of bad coffee and worked 3/4 of a crossword and sat with the particular quality of fear that has nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait. Reed had offered to come. I had told him no, not because I didn't want him there, but because one of us needed to remain functional, and I wasn't certain I was going to be able to manage that myself. At 1:57, Dr. Osei came through the double doors in her scrubs and walked toward me with her mask pulled down and her expression neutral in the specific way that doctors make their expressions neutral when the news is good and they don't want you to collapse in the waiting room before they can deliver it properly. The procedure was successful, she said. The new valve is seated correctly. Her heart function is already showing improvement. She's in recovery, and she's asking for you. I sat back down in the chair because my legs made that decision before I did. Thank you, I said, which was insufficient but was all I had. Maggie spent 4 more days in the cardiac unit before Dr. Osei cleared her to transition to home recovery. On the morning of the 4th day, I arrived early to help pack up the room, The books she'd accumulated from the exchange with her neighbor, the extra cardigan I'd brought from home, the photographs I'd taped to the whiteboard, because hospital rooms without photographs felt to me like places where people were expected to be sick rather than places where people were expected to get well. Nora Whitfield was finishing her overnight shift when I arrived. She was the charge nurse on the cardiac floor, a compact, direct woman in her mid-50s with the kind of unhurried competence that comes from doing important work for a long time without requiring recognition for it. She had been Maggie's primary nurse for most of the stay, and Maggie had told me on day 2 that Nora was the best nurse she'd ever had, which from Maggie was the highest available rating. She slept well, Nora told me at the door. Vitals are excellent this morning. She's been awake since 5:30 reading. A small smile. She finished 2 books last night. That's how I know she's recovering, I said. Maggie was sitting up in bed with her reading glasses on when I came in, looking precisely like herself, which was the best thing I had seen in recent memory. We talked for a while about practical things, the home care schedule Dr. Osei had outlined, the medications, the follow-up appointments. Maggie wanted to know if the bougainvillea had been watered. I told her it had. She looked at me with the expression that meant she knew I was lying, but was going to let it go this time. When she dozed off after breakfast, I started packing. The room had accumulated the particular archaeology of a long hospital stay, layers of small things that arrive gradually and must be sorted on departure. I worked through the shelves first, then the windowsill, then the closet. The nightstand drawer I saved for the last, the way I always left the hardest part of any job for the last, so that finishing it meant finishing everything. Inside the drawer, a tube of hand cream, a pair of reading glasses with a bent frame that were her backup pair, a bookmark shaped like a hummingbird that Sophie had made in art class and mailed to the hospital, and beneath all of those things, held together with a rubber band, a stack of envelopes. I counted them. 11. They were greeting card envelopes, the standard size, the kind that come with birthday cards sold at grocery store checkout lines. Each one was addressed to Maggie in Preston's handwriting, the particular print and cursive hybrid he'd developed in high school and never changed. Each one had a postmark. The oldest was dated 4 years ago. The most recent was from the previous October. Not one of them had been opened. I held them for a moment, turning the stack over in my hands, looking at the postmarks, doing the arithmetic. 11 envelopes over 4 years. Birthdays, probably. Maybe a Mother's Day or 2. Each one sealed, each one bearing a first-class stamp, each one addressed in the handwriting of a son to his mother, and each one as pristine as the day it arrived. I was still holding them when Nora came in to check the monitors. She saw the envelopes in my hands, and she did not immediately say anything, which told me she had seen them before. She finished what she was doing with the monitors, made a notation on her tablet, and then looked at me with the directness I had come to associate with her. She asked me to keep those in the drawer, Nora said. About 3 weeks into her stay. She'd had them in her bag, brought them from home, I think. A pause. I asked her if she wanted me to read them to her in case they were important. She said no. She said she knew what was in them. I looked at the top envelope. Preston's handwriting. Maggie's name. She said she'd been receiving them for a few years. Nora continued, her voice careful and even. A card sometimes with a check inside. Around birthdays and holidays. She said her son sent them instead of visiting. Another pause. She said she kept them because she didn't want to throw away something her child had touched. But she couldn't open them either because opening them would mean acknowledging that a card was all she was going to get. The room was very quiet around that sentence. She told me something else, Nora said. She said she kept them out of her house so her husband wouldn't find them. She said. Nora glanced at me briefly, with the particular discretion of someone choosing how much to deliver at once. She said her husband had enough to carry, without knowing that their son thought a check in an envelope covered what he owed. I set the envelopes down on the nightstand very carefully. Maggie was sleeping. Her chest rose and fell with the new valve doing the work. The old one had stopped being able to do her face smooth and untroubled in the morning light, one hand resting on the blanket near the hummingbird bookmark Sophie had made. She had been absorbing this for 4 years. 4 years of cards arriving in the mail. 4 years of knowing what they meant and what they didn't mean. 4 years of carrying that knowledge in a bag she brought with her to the hospital so that I wouldn't find the envelopes at home. 4 years of protecting me from the particular pain of knowing that my son had decided a check was an adequate substitute for his presence in his mother's life. I had thought I understood what Maggie had been protecting me from. I had thought it was just the financial situation, just the loans and the broken promises, just the ordinary accumulation of disappointment that parents absorb when children don't turn out the way they hoped. I had not understood the depth of it until this moment, standing in a hospital room on a Tuesday morning with 11 unopened envelopes in my hand and my wife sleeping 3 feet away. The anger came differently this time, not cold, not hot, but something else entirely. Something that had no name I could locate that lived in the place where love and grief meet and neither one wins. I put the envelopes in my jacket pocket. When Maggie woke up 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the chair beside her bed, and when she looked at me, she knew immediately the way she had always known things about me before I said them, which had unnerved me at 27 and felt at 67 like the greatest gift a person could be given. "Jean," she said. "I found them," I said. She reached across the blanket and put her hand over mine, and her grip was stronger than it had been in months. And she didn't say she was sorry, because she understood that the thing she had done had been an act of love and not something that required apology. "Are you all right?" she asked. I turned my hand over and held hers. "I will be," I said. "I promise." Catherine Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Anacapa Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse and 2 blocks from the pawn shop where Frank DeLuca had accepted Maggie's ring 6 weeks earlier. I noticed the proximity when I parked. Santa Barbara was a small city in the ways that mattered. Catherine had handled 2 real estate matters for me in the previous decade, a boundary dispute with a neighbor in 2016, and the title transfer on the Coos Bay Marina when I'd refinanced in 2019. She was 53, precise in the way that people who work with documents for a living become precise, and she had the particular quality of attention that I associated with professionals who understood that the details their clients considered minor were usually the ones that decided outcomes. Reed was already there when I arrived, sitting in one of the chairs across from her desk, with a laptop open and a USB drive on the table in front of him. He looked up when I came in, and I could see that he had not slept particularly well, which was his way of caring about things he didn't say out loud. I set my own folder on the desk, printed bank records, the envelope from Patricia Holt's contact at the county clerk's office, the notification placard from the kitchen camera manufacturer, and the 11 unopened envelopes from Maggie's hospital nightstand, which I had included not as legal evidence but because Catherine had asked me to bring everything, and I was done deciding on my own what mattered. She went through the materials methodically the way she always worked, without commentary, until she had the full picture. "Walk me through the camera footage," she said finally. Reed connected the USB drive to her desktop and pulled up the file. 41 seconds of Preston in my kitchen phone to his ear, describing in his own voice and his own words exactly what he had done to his brother and what he intended to do next. The audio was clean, the directional microphone on the camera had been positioned well, and Preston had been standing directly beneath it, close to the counter, speaking at a normal volume, with the confidence of a man who believed he was alone. Catherine watched it twice without expression. "The notification placard," she said. "Tell me about the placement." Mounted at eye level beside the back entry door, I said. Printed from the manufacturer's template, dated the day of installation. I have a photograph of it in position taken the same day, time-stamped by my phone. She nodded. Under California Penal Code Section 632, audio recording in a private space requires the consent of all parties. However, recording in your own home with proper notice posted at the point of entry creates a reasonable expectation that recording is occurring. Courts have upheld home security recordings under these conditions. This is usable. She turned to the financial documents. The $95,000 withdrawal pattern from Callaway Construction's operating account, the transfers Patricia had documented, was laid out across 3 pages of bank statements. Catherine examined the destination account information with the focused attention of someone recognizing a pattern she had seen before. Tortious interference with prospective economic advantage, she said, setting down the Novatech materials. Defamation. The fabricated disciplinary file constitutes false statements of fact communicated to a third party that caused measurable economic harm. Fraud. The unauthorized financial transfers. Possibly elder financial abuse under the Welfare and Institutions Code given your age and the nature of the relationship. She looked at me. These are serious causes of action. The camera recording alone is significant, but combined with the courier documentation, the fraternity connection between your son and Derek Ashworth. Derek Ashworth, I said. That's the name of the HR director at Novatech. In the recording, Preston refers to him as Colton. That's a nickname, Derek Colton Ashworth. They've called him Colton since college. Catherine wrote it down. Combined with that connection and the financial documentation, you have a case with genuine teeth. She set down her pen. My recommendation is a formal demand letter. Give Preston 60 days to respond with full restitution, the loan's damages for Reed's lost job opportunity, legal fees. If he refuses or fails to respond, we file suit, and this becomes public record. And if he wants to settle, Reed said, then we consider the terms. Catherine looked at Reed with the directness she applied to everything. But I want to tell you both something. In my experience, people who have behaved the way your brother has behaved do not voluntarily take responsibility. They take responsibility when the alternative is worse. The goal of the demand letter is to make the alternative significantly worse. Reed looked at me. I had been listening to all of this with the particular quality of attention I used to give to engineering assessments, tracking the structure, identifying the load-bearing elements, calculating what would hold and what wouldn't. Catherine was good. The case was solid. The 60-day clock was a reasonable instrument, but there was something I needed to say before we went further. Reed, I said, before we talk about next steps, I need to ask you something directly. He looked at me. Miles Garrett told you about the Novatech situation 3 days before I found out. I said. You knew what Preston had done. You knew about Ashworth. I kept my voice even because this was not an accusation. It was a question that I needed the honest answer to. You let Preston believe he'd gotten away with it. You came over for dinner and you didn't tell me. Why? Reed was quiet for a moment, not evasively, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing words that are accurate rather than words that sound good. Because I needed you to have the recording first, he said. If I told you 3 days earlier, what would you have done? I started to answer. You would have confronted him, Reed said. You would have called him or gone to his house and he would have denied everything and destroyed whatever he could. The fake file at Novatech would have disappeared. His communication with Ashworth would have been wiped. There would have been nothing. He looked at Catherine, then back at me. I needed him to feel safe long enough for the camera to do its work. I needed him to walk into your kitchen and make that phone call thinking he'd already won. A pause. So I waited. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I'm not sorry I waited. The office was quiet around that. Catherine was looking at Reed with an expression I recognized as professional respect. "He's right," she said to me. "If you had confronted Preston without the recording, this conversation today would be significantly more difficult." I sat with that for a moment, the particular feeling of realizing that your youngest child has been protecting you with more sophistication than you'd known he possessed. "All right," I said. "There's one more thing," Reed said. He reached into his jacket and produced his phone, navigated to something, and turned the screen toward Catherine. "Sophie came to see Dad last week. She's 12, Preston's daughter. She found text messages on the family iPad. Screenshots of Preston communicating with someone about falsifying the marina property documentation." He set the phone on the desk. "I've already had a colleague verify the metadata. The screenshots are authentic and unaltered." Catherine looked at the phone for a long moment. "How did a 12-year-old come to have these?" she asked. "She was watching a movie on the iPad," I said. "The messages came through on the family account. She read them, didn't know what else to do, and brought them to me." I paused. She was frightened. She didn't know she was doing anything significant. She just knew it was wrong. Catherine nodded slowly. "The screenshots are admissible," she said. "She accessed them on a device she had legitimate permission to use through an account she was authorized on. There's no unlawful interception." She looked at the two of us across her desk. "Mr. Calloway, I've been practicing law in this county for 24 years. I want you to understand what you've brought me today." She tapped the stack of materials. "This isn't a family dispute. This is a documented pattern of financial fraud, professional sabotage, and elder exploitation. Your son's attorney, whoever that ends up being, is going to look at this evidence package and advise him to settle before this gets anywhere near a courtroom." She picked up her pen. "Let's talk about the number," she said. The doorbell rang at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, which I noted because Tuesday afternoons were when I drove Maggie to her post-operative follow-up appointments at Cottage Hospital, and I had just returned 30 minutes earlier and was still in the kitchen putting away the grocery bag I'd stopped for on the way home. I opened the door expecting the mail carrier who sometimes rang when there was a package too large for the box. Sophie was standing on the porch with her school backpack still on her shoulders and her hair coming loose from its ponytail, and her eyes doing the particular thing that eyes do when someone has been holding themselves together for longer than they should have had to. She was 12 years old, and she looked in that moment about 8. "Grandpa," she said. And then she stopped, because whatever she had planned to say next had apparently decided not to come in the order she'd rehearsed it. "Come in," I said. "Come sit down." She followed me to the kitchen and sat in the chair that faced the window, the same chair Preston had sat in when he'd come with the casserole, which I noted and set aside. I put a glass of milk on the table in front of her, without asking, because Sophie had been drinking milk at my kitchen table since she was old enough to hold a cup, and some things you don't ask about, you just do. She wrapped both hands around the glass and looked at it for a moment. "Does your mom know you're here?" I asked. She shook her head. "Your dad?" Another shake. I sat down across from her and waited. Outside the window, the bougainvillea was coming back with the early warmth of April, throwing itself over the fence line with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting all winter for permission to grow. Maggie was going to be pleased about that. "Things at home are really bad," Sophie said finally. Her voice was careful in the way that children's voices get when they are trying to sound older than they are and not quite managing it. "Mom and Dad they're not really talking to each other. Like they're in the same house, but they're not." She looked up at me. "It's been like that since the night at their house, when you came over with Reed and that lady." I know, I said. I'm sorry you've been in the middle of that. I'm not in the middle. Her chin came up slightly, a gesture I recognized, though I hadn't seen it on her face before. It was Maggie's gesture, the one that meant the speaker had decided to be precise. I'm not in the middle because I know what happened. I know what Dad did. She swallowed. That's why I came. She unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and took out her iPad, the white one with the cracked corner that she'd had for 2 years, and set it on the table between us with the deliberateness of someone putting down something heavy. About 6 weeks ago, she said, I was in the kitchen at home really late. Mom and Dad were in their room with the door closed and they were arguing, and I couldn't sleep, so I took the iPad downstairs to watch something. We have a family account, so I was logged in as me, but I could see the messages because the account is shared and sometimes notifications come through. She touched the edge of the iPad without picking it up. Dad had been texting someone. The messages were coming through on the screen while I was trying to find something to watch. She looked at me steadily. I wasn't trying to read them, but they were right there, and the words were, I couldn't not read them. What did they say? I asked. There were a lot of messages, going back a while. She picked up the iPad, now navigated to the screenshots folder, and turned the screen toward me. I didn't know what to do, so I took pictures of the screen. I took pictures of all of it. I looked at the screenshots. There were 14 of them. Text exchanges between Preston and a contact saved as RD initials I didn't recognize, which suggested someone outside the family circle, someone Preston had been careful to identify only partially. The messages were not subtle once you understood what you were reading. References to the marina documentation and the title situation. A message from Preston that read, if we can establish a management agreement first, the transfer challenge becomes easier. I need something on paper that shows ongoing involvement. A response from RD that only works if the old man signs voluntarily. Otherwise, you're looking at a different approach. Preston's reply, working on it. Give me 60 days. Working on it. 60 days. The final message in the chain was dated 3 weeks ago. Preston's situation has complicated. Need to pause. Will advise. RD understood. File is ready when you need it. File is ready. I set the iPad down on the table very carefully. Sophie was watching me with the expression of someone who has handed over a burden and is waiting to find out whether the person they handed it to can carry it. Do you understand what these messages mean? I asked her. She nodded slowly. They were going to try to take the marina, the one in Oregon. Her voice was still careful, still holding itself together. I've heard you talk about it my whole life, Grandpa. You took me there when I was 7. I remember the boats. She pressed her lips together. I didn't know what else to do. I thought about telling Mom, but Mom and Dad are... She stopped. Started again. I thought about telling Reed, but I didn't have his number, and I kept thinking that maybe I was wrong about what it meant, that maybe I was misreading it. Her eyes filled not with the theatrical tears of a child performing distress, but with the quiet overflow of someone who has been carrying something alone for 6 weeks. But I wasn't wrong, was I? No, I said. You weren't wrong. She nodded. A single tear ran down her left cheek and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she applied to everything, which was so thoroughly Maggie that it made my chest ache. Sophie, I said, what you did took courage. Do you understand that you did a very hard thing? I just took pictures, she said. You saw something wrong, and you didn't look away from it, I said. That's not a small thing. That's one of the hardest things there is. She picked up her milk and drank some of it, and I could see her processing this, filing it somewhere useful, the way she processed most things. She was 12 years old, and she was already better at sitting with difficult truths than most adults I had known. "Is Grandma okay?" she asked. "She's doing very well, Mahon," I said. "She's been asking about you. Can I see her?" "Come Sunday," I said. "She'd like that." Sophie nodded and re-zipped her backpack with the methodical care of someone who has finished a task and is preparing for the next one. She stood up, straightened the strap on her shoulder, and looked at me across the kitchen table with her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and something entirely her own, something clear and steady and not yet worn down by the world. "Grandpa," she said. "Yes. Whatever you're doing, make sure it works." I looked at my granddaughter, 12 years old, standing in my kitchen with a cracked iPad and 6 weeks of carried silence and the particular courage of someone who understands that doing right and doing easy are almost never the same thing. "It will," I said. "I promise." After she left, I sat for a while at the table. The iPad was in my hands. 14 screenshots. RD and his ready file. Preston's 60-day timeline that had run out before he'd expected it to. I picked up my phone and called Catherine Marsh. "The documentation package just got stronger," I said when she answered. "I'm going to email you something tonight. There are phone calls that tell you exactly who someone has always been, not who they pretended to be. Not who you hoped they were, but the real person underneath all of it, finally visible because they need something and have run out of ways to hide it." Preston called on a Wednesday morning in mid-April. While I was in the backyard working through the garden beds, Maggie had asked me to water twice a week during her recovery. She was doing well, better than Dr. Osei had projected. She had graduated from the armchair to short walks around the block, and had started talking about replanting the herb section near the back steps, which I had learned to read as the most reliable sign that Maggie was returning to herself. When Maggie started planting gardens, she was going to be fine. I had my thumb over the nozzle, walking the hose along the row of lavender she'd planted 3 years ago, when the phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. Preston. I looked at the name for a moment. Then I answered. "Dad." Something in his voice was different, thinned out, stripped of the performance I'd been hearing for 39 years. He was trying to sound composed and not managing it, which told me more than anything he was about to say. "I need to talk to you. About the business. All right?" I said. I kept walking the hose along the lavender. "I'm in a tight spot." A pause, not the rehearsed kind from the $25,000 call 3 months ago, but the genuine kind, the pause of someone who has finally run out of script. 3 of my 4 major subcontractors have put me on credit hold. There's been some public commentary about the company. I need $180,000 in the next 30 days, or the Carpinteria project defaults. I waited. "The bank isn't moving fast enough," he said. "My contacts aren't. It's a difficult moment." Another pause, shorter this time, like he'd decided to stop delaying. "I want to talk to you about the marina." There it was. "What about it?" I said. "I want to make you an offer." His voice shifted registers, the one he used for negotiations, deliberate and reasonable sounding, performing steadiness he wasn't feeling. "Dad, you're 67 years old. The Coos Bay property is 400 miles away. A marina that size needs active management, oversight, maintenance, tenant coordination. It's a burden you don't need right now with everything going on with Mom." A beat. "I'm prepared to offer $1.8 million, clean sale, quick close. $1.8 million for a property assessed at 4.2. I stood in my backyard with the garden hose in my hand and looked at the lavender Maggie had planted, and listened to my son offer me 43 cents on the dollar for the thing I'd spent 31 years building, wrapped carefully in concern for my age, my health, my management burden, and I understood something clearly. He had not absorbed a single thing that had happened since Christmas. Not the canceled cards, not the frozen accounts, not the intervention at his house, not Patricia Holt walking through his front door, not the certified letters from Catherine Marsh that had arrived at his address 2 weeks ago. He still believed he was talking to the same man he'd been taking from for 3 years. He was wrong about that. "Preston," I said. My voice came out level and unhurried, the voice of a man standing in his garden on a Wednesday morning with nowhere else he needs to be. "I appreciate the offer, but I already have a buyer." Silence. "Who?" he said. "Someone who offered full market price," I said. "4.2 million. We've been working through the paperwork for several weeks." A longer silence with a different quality. The silence of someone recalculating everything at once. "Dad who, Reed," I said. I heard precisely what that name did when it landed. Not a response, not a word. Just the particular quality of silence a name makes when it arrives somewhere it was never supposed to reach. I moved the hose to the next row of lavender. "Reed doesn't have that kind of money," Preston said. The reasonableness was gone. Something raw had replaced it. "He's a software developer. He put together a private investment group," I said. "Friends, colleagues, people who know his work. He holds a managing interest. Your mother and I keep lifetime residency rights and a revenue share. Catherine Marsh has been handling the documentation." I paused. "He came to me in February, before any of this became what it became. He just asked whether I'd be willing to keep it in the family." Preston started talking faster. The offer was still on the table. Reed's arrangement sounded complicated. As the eldest son, he had legitimate interest in family assets. This was a misunderstanding. Families talked things through. It didn't need to go this way. I let him finish. "Preston," I said, "the demand letter from my attorney arrived at your house 2 weeks ago. You have 46 days to respond. I'd suggest you use them to speak with a lawyer rather than to call me." I ended the call and put the phone in my shirt pocket. It rang at 10:43. I was moving to the rosemary bed. Again at 10:51. The sage. 11:04. 11:17. 11:32. By noon, I had 11 missed calls and a thoroughly watered garden, which was the only outcome of the morning I had any interest in. I stood at the back door and looked at the beds along the south fence, lavender, rosemary, sage, and thought about a dock on the Oregon coast, where the water went still in the evenings, and you could hear nothing but wind and the quiet of a place built to last. Reed had asked me in February with his characteristic understatement whether I'd be open to keeping it in the family. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and stood for a moment looking at the notification placard beside the back door. "This property is monitored by video and audio security systems," and thought about everything that had been set in motion in this house over the past several months. Maggie called from the living room. Jean, who was on the phone. I dried my hands on the dish towel. "Wrong number," I said, and went to sit with my wife. That evening, Maggie and I sat on the back porch until the light was completely gone. The wooden chairs from Los Olivos, the citronella candle she insisted on the garden, smelling the way it does after it's been properly watered. She asked about the phone calls that morning. I told her it had been Preston, that Catherine was handling it. She looked at me with the expression that meant she understood there was more and was choosing to let me carry it for now. "He's going to have to face it eventually," she said. "I know. I'm ready for it." She put her hand on my arm and we sat until the candle burned low. At 10 o'clock, after Maggie was asleep, my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Reed Calloway had published a post. It was titled, "What Happened When I Told the Truth at My Father's Dinner Table." He began with Christmas Eve, not with accusations, with facts in sequence, with the specificity of someone who had been keeping careful records. The diagnosis, the cost, what was said at the table. He did not reproduce Preston's words directly. He described them and let the reader arrive at their own conclusions, which was both legally careful and more effective. He wrote about the ring in 2 sentences that were the most precise and painful things I have ever read about my own life. My father sold my mother's wedding ring to pay the deposit on her heart surgery. He did this 3 days after Christmas, alone, without telling anyone until it was done. Then came the digital forensics. The fabricated Novatech file, the courier tracking number from Hollister Avenue, Derek Ashworth's name, the fraternity connection, and 30 seconds of audio, Preston's own voice, clear and unhurried, describing exactly what he had done to his brother. 30 seconds. His own laugh. At 10:17, the Post had 41 shares. At 11:30, it had passed 2,000. Reed had ended it with one line, "Truth has a way of finding light." I'm trusting that. I turned off the light and got into bed without waking Maggie. "Jean," she said without opening her eyes, "I thought you were asleep." "Is it done?" I looked at the ceiling. "It started," I said. She made a small sound that meant she understood the distinction and thought it was the right one. By morning, it would be 15,000. By 8 o'clock, the Post had been shared 14,931 times. I checked the number while the coffee was brewing, then put the phone face down and didn't pick it up again until after breakfast. Some things need to happen at their own pace. Maggie came into the kitchen at 8:30 and looked at my face the way she'd been looking at it for 41 years. "Tell me," she said. So I did. Everything, the $25,000 and the Napa Valley photographs, the conservatorship scheme, the fabricated Novatech file, the kitchen camera, Claudia's $95,000, the 11 unopened envelopes. All of it in order without softening the parts that were difficult. When I finished, she sat with both hands around her mug. "The envelopes," she said finally. "I should have told you." "You carried it alone," I said. "Like I've been doing since December." She reached across and covered my hand. "We're done protecting each other from things." "Agreed. Agreed." Reed called at 9:47. His voice was alert, not excited, the tone of someone monitoring something developing faster than expected. Preston had lost 4 major contracts by 10 o'clock. Claudia had received a termination letter by 9:30. Derek Ashworth was no longer employed by Novatech by 8:30, and the Society for Human Resource Management had opened a review expected to end in permanent revocation of his credentials. "He's losing everything at once," Reed said. "Not with pleasure. The way an engineer describes a building coming down with precision and with awareness of the weight. I'm thinking," I told him. What I was thinking was this: Preston had not been undone by Reed's post. He had been undone by 39 years of treating the world as a resource rather than a relationship. The Post had simply made that visible. At 2:15, Claudia called. "You ruined our lives," she said. Her voice was stripped of everything, the polish, the precision, all of it gone. "No," I said. "I stopped protecting you from the lives you'd already chosen." She told me Preston was talking to a lawyer. I told her that was the right decision and gave her Catherine's name. After she hung up, Maggie looked at me across the table. "She called to say I ruined their lives," I said. Maggie picked up her coffee. "That's exactly right," she said. Reed came for dinner on a Thursday in early June, the first time the 3 of us had sat down together since before Christmas. Maggie cooked properly for the first time since surgery. The cast iron pan and the rosemary I'd been watering all spring and her grandmother's cornbread recipe still taped inside the cabinet. Reed brought a Pinot Noir from Lompoc that Maggie had mentioned once months ago in passing. He always remembered those things. After dinner, Reed and I sat on the back porch with our wine while Maggie read inside. Novatech sent their VP of Engineering, Reed said. 45 minutes. Director of Engineering, 230,000 base plus equity. But you said no. Novatech called me because of what happened to me. Austin Dynamics reached out the morning after the post went live before 5,000 shares. Their CTO sent 4 sentences. Said they'd been following my technical writing for 8 months and had a senior architect role they couldn't fill. Reed turned his glass. He saw my work first, not the story. That's the only basis I'm interested in. I had spent 40 years learning the difference between a ship that would hold in a storm and one that merely looked like it would. Reed had arrived at the same understanding on his own. When do you start? August 1st, senior architect. After a while, I told him about Catherine's call. Preston's attorney had reached out. Settlement $310,000 structured over 8 months, full amount. Reed was quiet. Then, is that what you wanted? I wanted basic dignity, I said. I wanted Maggie's surgery paid for without selling her ring. The money is accountability. What I wanted was the family I thought I had. I set down my glass. But some things don't go back to what they were. They go to something else. Reed looked at me for a long moment. Something else can still be good, he said, from inside the soft sound of Maggie turning a page. Yes, I said. It can. We arrived at Coos Bay on a Saturday afternoon in early November, 11 months after the Christmas dinner that had started all of this. Reed was waiting at the top of the dock ramp with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water, the way he'd been looking at things his whole life, quietly and with complete attention. The Callaway Marina sign was exactly as I'd left it. The cedar dock house, the cleats along the main pier, the view out to the headland where the Douglas firs came down almost to the waterline. Reed had restored the boathouse, updated the electrical panels, made the place what it had always deserved to be. He showed us without narrating it as an achievement which was his way. Frank DeLuca drove up from Santa Barbara on Sunday morning and came down the dock in work boots and a quilted vest. When Maggie held out her left hand, he looked at the ring with the same professional attention he'd given it across his glass counter the previous December, and smiled. "It suits the setting," he said. Maggie laughed, the full laugh, the one I hadn't heard since before her diagnosis. Sophie arrived at noon, moving down the dock ramp at the particular speed of a 12-year-old interpreting "don't run" as loosely as possible. She hugged Maggie carefully, then buried her face in my jacket and said, "It worked, Grandpa." "It did," I said. Reed came to stand beside me after Sophie ran off toward the boats. "Preston signed the final payment this morning," he said. Catherine confirmed it. I nodded. I want to be honest about what I felt, not satisfaction, not vindication, but something quieter. A grief for the distance between what my son could have been and what he chose to be, and alongside it, a releasing of the need for it to be different. He had made his choices. Whatever came next was his to build. "I hope he does the work," I said. Genuinely. Maggie was standing at the end of the dock when I walked out to her, one hand on the railing, face turned toward the water. The diamond caught the November light and threw it back in small, quiet pieces. She heard my footsteps and turned. "We did all right," she said. I took her hand. A pelican cleared the headland and was gone. We stayed until the light was completely off the water. Looking back at this grandpa stories, I made the mistake so many parents make. I confused love with unlimited patience for being taken advantage of. I told myself I was being generous. The truth is, I was being afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing my children's approval. Don't be like me. Set your boundaries early, clearly, and without apology. The people who truly love you will respect them. The ones who don't, that tells you everything you need to know. This family story taught me something I should have understood decades ago. Dignity is not something your children give you. It's something you keep for yourself or surrender. I surrendered mine for 3 years before I remembered who I was. I believe God doesn't call us to be doormats for anyone, not even the people we raised. He calls us to love with wisdom, not weakness. If this grandpa's stories reached something in you, a memory, a situation, you're living right now a boundary. You've been afraid to draw, leave it in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Share this family story with someone who needs it. And if these grandpa stories matter to you, subscribing to this channel costs you nothing and means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted with the sole purpose of sharing wisdom and life lessons. If that's not the content for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you're staying, there's more worth hearing.